Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere a little closer to home and a little more uncomfortable than medieval dungeons or pirate ships. We're going back to the 1980s, not the fun parts, not the leg warmers and the cassette tapes and the I want my MTV parts. We're talking about what it was actually like to be a woman in 1980s America, the part nobody puts in the nostalgia reel. The shoulder pads were loud, the hair was big, and the expectations absolutely suffocating. So before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Genuinely, no pressure. And a huge heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and you absolutely made the right call. Your suggestions shape this channel more than you know, and I mean that. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and somehow that makes all of this feel more right. Also, the channel is now live on Spotify. Link is in the description, so if you'd rather fall asleep through your earbuds while pretending to do something productive, that's an option now. Now, dim the lights, turn on a fan, pull whatever blanket is nearest to you and get horizontal. You've earned this. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was actually like to be a woman in the 1980s? Did she have to smile through a performance review while her male colleague with half her qualifications got the promotion? What happened if she got pregnant? Did she still have a job on Monday? What did she do when the doctor brushed off her pain and told her it was probably stress? Was she allowed to have a credit card in her own name without her husband's signature? Could she walk into a bar alone without being assumed to be looking for something she wasn't? Was the aerobics class freeing, or was it just another way someone found to tell her body wasn't quite right yet? And what exactly was she supposed to do with all that ambition in a decade that kept handing her a mop and calling it empowerment? Congratulations. You've just woken up as a woman in 1982 America. You have a perm, a pantsuit your mother disapproves of, and a nagging suspicion that the world is not quite as progressive as the commercials are making it look. Good luck. You open your eyes. It's a Tuesday morning somewhere in Reagan's America, and before your feet even hit the linoleum, the day has already made a few decisions about you. Your worth is being quietly calculated by people who haven't met you yet, based on what you look like, whether you smile enough, whether you seem too aggressive or not assertive enough, and crucially, whether you appear to be the kind of woman who might one day inconveniently need maternity leave. The alarm goes off and you already owe the world a performance. No, pressure, just the rest of your life. You get dressed. This is already a negotiation. The pantsuit says serious, but maybe too serious. Maybe you'll be called aggressive in the 11 o'clock meeting. The skirt says approachable, but approachable has a way of being confused with available, and you don't have the energy for that today. You stand in front of the mirror doing a calculation that has no correct answer, which is really the defining feature of being a woman in the 1980s. It's not that the rules are unfair, it's that the rules contradict each other, and nobody told you which one to follow first. Breakfast is fast. Coffee, maybe a piece of toast. Possibly nothing, because somewhere between the beauty magazines and the diet culture that has colonized every flat surface in your home, eating breakfast has started to feel like a moral position you haven't fully decided on yet. Your mother ate breakfast. Your mother also wasn't working full-time, running a household, and trying to figure out whether her performance review last Thursday was a genuine assessment or a polite way of telling her to smile more. You leave the house. Outside, the 1980s greet you with their particular brand of contradiction. A decade that is simultaneously telling women they can do anything and quietly making sure that doing anything costs significantly more than it cost a man. The decade has slogans. It has shoulder pads and power suits, and the word empowerment showing up in advertisements for everything from hairspray to mutual funds. What it does not have, in any reliable quantity, is structural support. The infrastructure, childcare, equal pay, legal protection from harassment, healthcare that takes your symptoms seriously, is either absent, inadequate, or filed under someone else's problem. At work, you will be competent. You're always competent. You've been competent since approximately the 4th grade, when you first understood that competence was the tax women paid just to be taken seriously, and that even paying it in full was no guarantee of the outcome. Your male colleague, who started the same month you did, and whose work product you have quietly been improving for 2 years, will be called ambitious. You will be called a lot of things, but ambitious usually isn't one of them, not as a compliment anyway. By the time you sit down at your desk, you've already managed roughly 11 invisible things that nobody noticed, 2 social calculations that required genuine skill, and 1 moment in the elevator where you smiled at a comment you found mildly offensive because the person who made it signs your expense reports. This is not weakness. This is Tuesday. The 1980s will tell you repeatedly that you have never had it better, and in some ways, compared to the decades before, that's even true. But better is not the same as good. And you know this the way you know a lot of things, quietly, completely, and mostly to yourself. Welcome to the decade. Your alarm already went off. The performance has begun. Here's something that will make you stare at the ceiling for a moment. Until 1974, a woman in America could be legally denied a credit card in her own name. And while the Equal Credit Opportunity Act technically changed that, the 1980s had a creative way of making progress feel like it hadn't quite arrived. Banks still asked if you were married. Loan officers still wanted to know about your husband's income. You could be a fully employed, bill-paying adult woman and still find yourself sitting across from a man in a polyester tie who spoke to your finances as though they were a hobby you'd taken up between school runs. Picture this. You walk into a bank, you have a job, you have a paycheck, you have frankly a better credit history than your neighbour Gary, who bought a boat on instalment and named it after a woman he dated in 1971. You want a credit card. The man behind the desk asks if your husband will be co-signing. You do not have a husband. The man behind the desk pauses in a way that suggests this is not the expected answer, and that your situation is at minimum irregular. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974 was supposed to fix this, and legally it did. Discrimination based on sex or marital status in credit decisions became illegal. But the law and the lived experience of walking into a bank while female are 2 different things, and in the 1980s the gap between them was wide enough to park Gary's boat in. Lenders found creative ways to factor in the same information under different language. A woman's income was sometimes discounted on the assumption that she might leave the workforce to have children. Her financial history, if it had been built under a married name, sometimes didn't follow her properly after divorce. The protections existed on paper. The paper was not always in the room with you. If you were married, your financial identity was often still effectively merged with your husband's in practice, even if it wasn't in law. Credit histories were shared, debt was joint, and if the marriage ended as marriages in the 1980s ended at rates that were making everyone's parents nervous, the financial untangling could be devastating. Women who had spent years building a life that was legally half theirs sometimes found, in the courtroom arithmetic of divorce, that half of something and a fragmented credit history didn't add up to a stable financial foundation. If you were single, you were navigating a system that had been designed around the assumption that you were temporary, a pre-married woman in a waiting room, not a permanent financial actor deserving of full access. The insurance rates, the mortgage qualifications, the credit limits, all of it carried a quiet surcharge for the crime of being financially independent and female, which the system read as financially precarious and probably your fault. There is something almost comedic about it, except that it isn't funny. The richest, most aggressively capitalist nation on earth spent most of the 20th century treating half its population as financially untrustworthy based on the contents of their wardrobe. You could run a household budget with military precision for 30 years and still be asked to bring your husband to the meeting. Gary, meanwhile, is refinancing the boat. You got the job. Congratulations, genuinely. You put in the work, you dressed the part, you mastered the art of seeming confident without seeming threatening, which is a skill that deserves its own graduate course. And now you're here, standing in an office that smells like burnt coffee and someone's ambition. The good news is that more women were entering the workforce in the 1980s than ever before. The bad news is that the workplace itself had not entirely received that memo. There were rules, but they were unwritten ones, and they mostly involved you being grateful, quiet and patient in that specific order. The 1980s office was a specific environment. Fluorescent lighting, drop ceilings, the sound of typewriters giving way to the new and terrifying clatter of early word processors. Men in suits, and women in suits that were specifically designed to look like men's suits, but weren't quite, as if the goal were to be taken seriously while still being identifiable as other. The shoulder pads were load-bearing. They were doing structural work, visually suggesting authority in rooms that were not yet prepared to hand it over. The hierarchy was mostly male at the top and mostly female at the support level, and this was considered natural rather than constructed. The way a lot of things that are constructed get considered natural when they've been in place long enough. You had a boss. Your boss had a secretary. The secretary, almost certainly, was smarter than at least 3 people in the meeting she was not invited to attend. Promotions moved slowly for women, not because women weren't performing, but because performing and being seen as promotion material were 2 different evaluations, and the second one was being made by people who had, for most of their careers, only promoted men. There's a comfortable familiarity to hiring and promoting people who look like the people who came before them. It requires no adjustment of assumptions. It is efficient in the way that a closed system is efficient, right up until you need it to produce something new. The women who made it into management in the 1980s often did so by working harder than the men around them, making fewer demands and absorbing a level of scrutiny their male counterparts were not subject to. A man who was direct was decisive. A woman who was direct was difficult. A man who negotiated his salary was smart. A woman who negotiated her salary was, depending on who was doing the evaluating, either admirable or a problem. And at the end of the day, you went home. Your male colleague, the one with comparable responsibilities and a roughly 38% higher salary, went to happy hour. He would network there, casually, over drinks that were technically optional but professionally essential, in a social setting that had been designed around the assumption that everyone going home had someone waiting there to handle things. You had things waiting at home, you handled them, and tomorrow you came back, and you were grateful, and quiet, and patient, and you did it again. There was no HR department waiting with a sympathetic ear and a formal complaint process. There was, more often than not, a woman sitting at her desk trying to decide whether what just happened was bad enough to say something about, or whether saying something would be worse. Sexual harassment in the 1980s workplace existed at a level that would make your blood pressure spike today, and the legal framework to address it was so thin it barely cast a shadow. The term itself had only been coined in the 1970s, and the landmark case that gave it legal weight, Merita Savings Bank versus Vinson, didn't reach the Supreme Court until 1986. Until then, it was mostly just called Tuesday. Let's be specific about what this looked like, because the phrase sexual harassment can sound abstract from a distance, and it wasn't abstract. It was a comment about your body from the man who approved your time-off requests. It was a hand on your shoulder that stayed a half-second longer than it should have, from someone whose recommendation you needed for the promotion you'd been working toward for 2 years. It was a joke that the whole room laughed at, and you laughed too, because not laughing would have been the thing people remembered. It was an environment, not just a series of incidents, a thermostat that had been set by someone else, in a room you had to work in regardless. Women in the 1980s workplace became expert at a very particular kind of navigation, the constant low-level management of other people's behaviour toward them, while simultaneously appearing not to be managing anything at all. You deflected without seeming cold. You redirected without seeming difficult. You kept the relationship functional while communicating, through tone and posture and careful word choice, that a line existed, knowing that the line was only as good as the other person's willingness to notice it. Reporting it was, for most women in most workplaces, not a realistic option. If there was anyone to report to, it was likely another man in a chain of command that was largely male, in a culture that defaulted to giving the benefit of the doubt to the person with seniority and taking it away from the person making the complaint. Being labelled a troublemaker was a career consequence. Being seen as someone who couldn't handle the environment was a career consequence. The complaint itself, even if believed, was a career consequence, because now you were the woman who had made things complicated. The Meriter ruling in 1986 helped. It established that a hostile work environment based on sex was a form of illegal discrimination, which was genuinely important. It gave legal language to something that had been happening without a legal name. But a Supreme Court ruling and a changed office culture are different things, and one does not automatically produce the other. The ruling happened in courtrooms. The harassment happened in break rooms and corridors and parking garages, in the space between the law and the daily reality of going to work. What women developed, in the absence of adequate protection, was a kind of internal triage system. This one I can ignore. This one I should document. This one is dangerous and I need to find another job. It was exhausting work, performed invisibly on top of the actual work they were hired to do. And the most unsettling part, the part that doesn't fit neatly into any narrative about progress, is that many women of that era will tell you, without bitterness, that they just got on with it. Because they had to. Because the mortgage was real. Because they had worked too hard to let someone else's behaviour be the reason they left. You had a baby. Wonderful news. Genuinely wonderful. And your employer agreed, in the tight, polite way that someone agrees when they're already mentally reassigning your projects. In 1982 America, there was no federally mandated paid maternity leave. There was no guaranteed job protection. The Family and Medical Leave Act, the one that gave women 12 whole weeks of unpaid leave, didn't exist until 1993. So in the 80s, what happened after you had a child was largely up to your employer's mood, your negotiating skills, and whether your boss happened to have a wife who had ever held a job. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act had passed in 1978, which meant your employer could not legally fire you for being pregnant. That was the flaw, and it was a genuinely important one, won through real effort. But the floor and the ceiling are not the same thing, and in the space between you can't fire her for being pregnant, and she will return to the same position, with the same trajectory and the same opportunities, was a gap that swallowed a lot of women's careers quietly and without leaving obvious evidence. There was a concept, formally named in a 1989 Harvard Business Review article, though it had been operating informally for years before that, called the mommy track. The idea was that women with children were functionally on a different professional path than women without, or than men in general, one that was more accommodating, more flexible, and almost entirely devoid of the fast-track opportunities that the other path offered. The mommy track was presented, sometimes sincerely, as a solution. What it actually was, more often, was a ceiling disguised as a choice. You came back from maternity leave, unpaid, possibly shortened because you couldn't afford to be away from the paycheck, and found that things had shifted slightly. Your projects had been redistributed. The assumption that you were fully available, the way you had been before, had been quietly revised. You were still valued, people made sure to say that, but the particular kind of value that comes with the most visible assignments and the clearest path to the next level had somehow moved sideways during your absence. Women who took any significant maternity leave reported wage penalties that compounded over time, not in a dramatic, traceable way, but in the accumulation of missed opportunities, of being passed over once and then again, of the momentum that a career requires and that an interruption, however brief, disrupts in ways that take years to recover from. For women who had multiple children, the math got progressively harder. The alternatives weren't better. Women who returned to work quickly, who minimised their maternity leave and demonstrated their commitment by being visibly, immediately back, sometimes found themselves criticised from the other direction, not dedicated enough to their family, making choices that would affect their children, setting an example that made other women look bad. You could be too much of a mother or not enough of one, and the professional world was perfectly happy to have opinions about which you were. The baby was real, the love was real, the exhaustion was real, and the career penalty was for many women just as real as all of it. The Equal Pay Act had been on the books since 1963. By the 1980s, women were still earning somewhere around 62 cents for every dollar a man made doing the same job. 62 cents. You could do the math during your lunch break, which, unlike your male colleagues, probably didn't involve a client and an expense account. The gap wasn't subtle and it wasn't hidden. It was just accepted, explained away with a rotating cast of justifications that all somehow ended with the conclusion that this was simply how things were. And if you'd like to discuss it further, there's a very long line. The explanations were always interesting. Women choose lower-paying fields, went one. Women work fewer hours on average, went another. Women leave the workforce for family responsibilities, went a third. And there was truth in some of the data behind these arguments, structural truths about an economy that had been designed around male workers, that had historically concentrated women in lower-paying roles, that punished career interruptions for childbearing in ways it didn't punish anything equivalent for men. But pointing that out made people uncomfortable, because it suggested the solution wasn't women should make different choices, but rather the structure needs to change, which is a much more expensive and inconvenient conclusion. In the 1980s, you could look at your paycheck and at your colleague Dave's paycheck and see the gap plainly, and still have very limited legal recourse. The Equal Pay Act required equal pay for equal work, but proving equal work was complicated, and employers had discretionary tools, seniority systems, merit-based pay structures, catch-all categories of any factor other than sex that could make a discriminatory wage difference look, on paper, like the product of neutral criteria. The problem was also deeply embedded in which jobs paid what. Nursing, teaching, social work, administrative support, fields dominated by women, were paid less than fields with comparable skill requirements that happened to be dominated by men. This wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was the direct consequence of a labour market that had, for most of its history, assumed female labour was supplementary, temporary, or less serious than male labour, and had priced it accordingly. By the time the 1980s arrived, those assumptions were outdated. The wages that reflected them were not. There was a concept called comparable worth, the idea that jobs requiring similar levels of skill, effort, and responsibility should be paid similarly regardless of which gender tended to hold them. It was a genuinely compelling argument, and it gained traction in policy conversations during the early part of the decade. It also generated fierce opposition, because restructuring wages across entire sectors of the economy was not a small project, and the people with the most to gain were not, in most cases, the people making the decisions. Some states moved forward with comparable worth adjustments for public employees. The federal government did not, and so the gap persisted, measured and documented and discussed, while women went to work every day and did the math and knew exactly what it added up to, not just in each paycheck, but compounded across a career, translating into lower social security benefits, smaller retirement savings, and less financial resilience in exactly the moments. Divorce, illness, widowhood, when financial resilience matters most. 62 cents. Every dollar. Every day. The math was always right there. The 1980s had opinions about how you should look, and those opinions were not shy. They came at you from every magazine cover, every television commercial, every well-meaning colleague who complimented you on your figure in the same breath as your quarterly report. The ideal was specific: thin but not too thin, fit but not muscular, well-groomed but not high maintenance, young-looking but not frivolous, hair big, makeup present but natural, heels recommended but suffering quietly through them considered part of the bargain, and underneath all of it was the unspoken understanding that your appearance was being factored into your professional credibility, whether you liked it or not. Magazines in the 1980s were doing a specific kind of damage at scale. You had your Cosmopolitans and your Vogues and your Glamours and your ladies' home journals, and they all operated on the same basic editorial principle. Here is the ideal, here is how far you fall short of it, and here are 17 products and 4 diet plans to help you close the gap before next month's issue, when we'll repeat the process. The before and after format, already a staple, implied that the before state, the ordinary state, the state you woke up in every morning, was a problem, a draft in need of revision. The physical ideal had a very specific 1980s flavour. After a decade of lean 70s chic, the 80s gave you Jane Fonda and aerobics, and the concept of toning, which was essentially a way of saying your body needed to be smaller and harder simultaneously, a goal that required both caloric restriction and physical exertion, performed cheerfully and without apparent effort. The ideal body was a body that looked like it had never eaten anything regrettable, and also somehow had the muscle definition of someone who exercised for 2 hours a day. These goals were not incompatible technically. They were just very difficult to achieve while also holding down a job, raising children and being a person. Workplace appearance standards added another layer. Professional dress codes for women in the 80s were a minefield of competing signals. Too feminine and you weren't taken seriously. Too masculine and you were trying too hard. Showing too much was inappropriate. Showing too little suggested you'd given up. The goal was to be professionally neutral, which is an invisible standard, because professionally neutral had been defined by and for men, and fitting into it while being visibly, undeniably female required a level of daily calibration that men simply did not have to perform. Age was another dimension entirely. The beauty industry in the 1980s began its full-scale colonization of the anti-aging market, giving women a new thing to be anxious about and a new category of products to spend money on. Wrinkles, grey hair, the visible signs of having been alive for several decades, all were reframed as problems with solutions, and the solutions were for sale at the cosmetics counter. Men who aged were distinguished. Women who aged were advised to consult with someone about it. And yet, and this is the part worth sitting with, many women genuinely enjoyed getting dressed, wearing makeup, engaging with fashion and beauty as creative acts. The problem was never pleasure, it was compulsion. It was the difference between choosing to participate and understanding that not participating would cost you something. When beauty becomes a professional and social prerequisite rather than an option, it stops being a source of enjoyment and becomes one more performance you're expected to give, indefinitely, without acknowledgement that it takes any effort at all. The 1980s were, in many ways, the golden age of being told your body was a problem to be solved. Slim Fast was launched in 1977 and hit its stride in the 80s. Jane Fonda's workout tapes flew off shelves. Calorie counting became a social activity. The word diet stopped being a noun and became a verb, something you were always perpetually somewhat failing at. Women in the 1980s were surrounded by a culture that treated hunger as a character flaw, and a smaller body as a moral achievement. You weren't just eating lunch, you were making a statement about your self-discipline, your worth, and your relationship with the concept of wanting things. The diet industry in the 1980s was a multi-billion-dollar operation, and it ran on a very elegant business model. Sell women a solution to a problem, ensure the solution doesn't permanently work, and sell them the next solution. Weight Watchers, Jenny Craig, Slim Fast, the Scarsdale Diet, the Beverly Hills Diet, the Pritikin Diet. The decade produced a conveyor belt of eating programs, each one arriving with testimonials and promises, each one quietly setting you up for the very specific failure of weight cycling, which is losing weight and regaining it, which then required a new program, which the industry was very prepared to provide. Nutritional science in the 1980s was also, to put it charitably, in progress. The low-fat movement was at full tilt, based on research that was more nuanced than the way it got applied, and the food industry, delighted by the opportunity, produced an avalanche of low-fat products that replaced fat with sugar and called it healthy. Women following the dietary advice of the era were often eating in ways that didn't actually serve their bodies, becoming more confused rather than less, and then being told that their confusion was their fault for not being disciplined enough. Eating disorders were rising sharply during this period. Anorexia and bulimia, particularly common among young women, were getting increased clinical attention in the 80s, though the cultural conversation around them often still framed extreme thinness as aesthetically understandable, if medically concerning. The same magazine that ran a feature on eating disorder warning signs would, 3 pages later, run a story about a celebrity's impressive 20-pound weight loss and the diet that produced it. The contradiction was not acknowledged, because acknowledging it would have required the culture to look at what it was actually doing. Food became moralized in a way that went beyond nutrition. Good foods and bad foods, cheat days and earning your dinner through exercise. The language of dieting was the language of guilt and penance, borrowed directly from its religious framework and applied to the act of eating a piece of bread. Women talked about food the way people talk about something they're trying to resist, a temptation rather than a pleasure, a negotiation rather than a meal. At a dinner table in the 1980s, it was perfectly normal for women to discuss what they had eaten that day, what they weren't allowing themselves, what they were saving up for, as though the act of eating required budgeting and justification. Men at the same table mostly just ate. That difference, unremarkable at the time, quietly revealing in retrospect, says something about what the decade decided women's bodies were for and who had the right to have opinions about them. You were what you weighed, you were whether you resisted, and the resisting was never ever finished. The aerobics boom of the 1980s arrived dressed in neon spandex and told women it was liberation. And for some, it genuinely was movement, sweat, community, women, taking up space in a room and using their bodies with joy. But the other half of the story was that the fitness industry had discovered something extremely profitable. Women who felt bad about themselves. Gyms, tapes, supplements and workout gear all leaned hard into the idea that your body was a renovation project. You weren't exercising for health or happiness. You were exercising to earn the right to exist comfortably in your skin. There's a difference, and the 80s made sure you knew which one the marketing was about. Jane Fonda launched her first workout video in 1982. It sold 17 million copies. 17 million. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the population of the Netherlands all collectively deciding to follow a woman in leg warmers through a series of exercises designed to, as the cover copy enthusiastically suggested, help you get the body you've always wanted. The implicit message in the body you've always wanted is that the body you currently have is not the one you want. The workout tape was the product. The body dissatisfaction was the subscription service. Aerobic studios opened everywhere. They were loud, they were mirrored, and they were almost exclusively attended by women in outfits that the decade had decided were simultaneously athletic and visually appealing, which is a combination that tells you something about who the aesthetic was designed for. The leotard and leggings ensemble was functional, technically. It was also extremely form-revealing, which sat a little awkwardly alongside the idea that women were there to exercise rather than to be evaluated. But the 80s didn't spend a lot of time on that particular tension. The instructor at the front of the class was, almost without exception, thin, very thin, in the way that communicated aspiration rather than health. A body that said this is what sufficient discipline produces, and also implied that your current body was evidence of insufficient discipline. The classes had names like body sculpting and tone and firm and shape up, all of which locate the problem firmly in the body as it exists and the solution firmly in the class you're paying for. Nobody called it cardiovascular health or stress reduction. The product being sold was a different body. Your body was the raw material. The irony is that exercise, actual, regular, vigorous physical movement, is genuinely good for you. Women who found community and strength and physical joy in the aerobics rooms of the 1980s received something real. The human body responds to movement with benefits that go well beyond appearance. But those benefits were not what the marketing was about. The marketing was about thighs. The marketing was always, in the 80s, about thighs and what could be done about them. What the fitness industry found in the 1980s, and what it has been building on ever since, is that combining a legitimate good thing with a manufactured anxiety about the body creates an extremely durable revenue stream. You can keep selling the solution indefinitely because the standard it's measured against keeps moving. You get fit, and the ideal gets slightly more specific. You tone, and the definition of toned gets revised. The goalposts don't stay put, which means the aerobics tape, like the diet plan before it, is never quite the last one you'll need. Brilliant business model, exhausting life. Roe versus Wade had been decided in 1973, which meant that by the 1980s, the right to abortion was the law of the land, technically. In practice, access varied wildly depending on where you lived, how much money you had, and how far you were willing to travel. The Reagan administration came into office with a firmly anti-abortion platform and spent the decade chipping away at funding and access wherever federal power allowed. Clinics faced protests, funding was cut under the Mexico City policy, and the Hyde Amendment blocked Medicaid coverage for abortion services. Reproductive rights existed on paper in the 80s. Getting to them was another matter entirely. The Hyde Amendment had been passed in 1976, 3 years after Roe, and it did something specific and consequential. It prohibited the use of federal Medicaid funds to cover abortion services except in the most narrowly defined circumstances. What this meant in practical terms was that the right established in Roe was effectively available to women who could pay for it privately, and significantly less available to women who couldn't. Reproductive rights, like so many rights in America, came with an unofficial income requirement. The decision was legal. The access was not equal. Clinics providing abortion services in the 1980s operated in a climate of escalating harassment. Anti-abortion activism, energized by the alignment between the religious right and the Reagan administration, became increasingly organized and confrontational during the decade. Clinic blockades, protests outside facilities, harassment of staff and patients, the physical act of accessing legal health care required running a gauntlet that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with intimidation. Women who went to clinics in the 80s sometimes did so past crowds of people, holding signs and calling them by names they hadn't offered. It was a legal medical appointment conducted under conditions that no other legal medical procedure required. Contraception was its own minefield. The 1980s brought AIDS into the public consciousness in ways that had enormous implications for how society talked about sex, bodies and personal responsibility, and much of that conversation landed on women. Birth control remained contested at the policy level, with debates about whether employers or insurers should be required to cover it. Access varied by geography, income and insurance. Status. Women who wanted to manage their own fertility in the 1980s could do so, in many cases, but rarely without navigating costs, stigma, and a healthcare system that treated reproductive health as a specialized, sometimes controversial category rather than basic medicine. The political landscape of the decade made it clear that what Roe had guaranteed was not permanent. The Reagan administration's appointments to the federal judiciary were reshaping the courts in ways that would play out for decades. Women who were paying attention could see the architecture being constructed around the ruling, not dismantling it outright, not yet, but reducing its practical reach, narrowing the circumstances in which it operated, and making clear that its continued existence was contingent rather than settled. What this created was a decade in which women's reproductive decisions were never simply their own. They were political. They were contested. They were subject to the opinions of legislators and religious organizations and protesters and policymakers in ways that no other medical decision was. The decision about whether to continue a pregnancy, one of the most personal decisions a human being can make, was conducted in 1980s America under conditions of ongoing public argument about whether the decision itself should be permitted. That level of externally imposed scrutiny on an internal private choice does something to a person. It made ordinary healthcare feel like a battleground. Because for many women in the 1980s it was. In the 1980s, domestic violence was still widely treated as a private matter, a family issue, something to be handled behind closed doors and discussed, if at all, in hushed tones. Police were often reluctant to intervene in domestic disputes. Shelters for survivors existed but were underfunded and overwhelmed. A woman leaving an abusive partner faced not just the physical danger of leaving, but a legal and financial system that was largely indifferent to her situation. Courts sometimes questioned her choices, her behaviour, her role in provoking the situation. The Violence Against Women Act didn't arrive until 1994. Until then, too many women were on their own in the most dangerous sense of the phrase. When police were called to a home in the 1980s for what the report would log as a domestic disturbance, the most common outcome was not an arrest. It was a conversation. Officers would sometimes separate the parties, talk to the husband, talk to the wife, and then leave, with the understanding that what happened inside a marriage was at some fundamental level between the people in it. Mandatory arrest policies for domestic violence calls were not widespread until later in the decade, and even where they existed, enforcement was inconsistent. A woman calling the police was not guaranteed protection. She was in many cases guaranteed a brief interruption followed by the same situation, now with the added variable of an angry partner who knew she'd called. Leaving was its own impossible equation. The statistics on domestic violence lethality, the data showing that the most dangerous period for a woman in an abusive relationship is when she attempts to leave, were known in academic and advocacy circles, but had not penetrated the public conversation. The cultural narrative about domestic violence in the 80s still carried a heavy undertow of victim responsibility. Why does she stay? Why doesn't she just leave? There must be something she's doing to provoke this. The question was never why does he hit her? The question was always, with the patience of someone who genuinely didn't understand the obstacle, why doesn't she simply walk out the door? The answer was layered and practical. Finances, because in many cases the abusive partner controlled the money, and a woman leaving had no credit history, no savings, and no immediate income. Children, because leaving with children required somewhere to go, and leaving without them was unthinkable. Housing, because the shelter system in the 1980s was dramatically under-resourced, with waiting lists and limited capacity and rules that made them inaccessible to some of the women who needed them most. Legal protection, because restraining orders existed but were only as good as enforcement, and enforcement was unreliable. And then, underneath all of it, the psychological weight of a relationship that had been designed systematically to make a woman believe she had no options. The women who did leave did so at enormous personal cost and frequently without institutional support. Organisations like the National Domestic Violence Hotline, now considered a baseline resource, didn't exist until 1996. Advocacy groups were doing crucial work with insufficient funding in a political environment that treated domestic violence as a social services issue rather than a criminal justice one, which affected both the resources allocated to it and the seriousness with which it was pursued. What the 1980s did, slowly and imperfectly, was begin to shift the conversation. Researchers were documenting the scope of the problem. Advocates were pushing for legal reform. A few high-profile cases brought the issue into public view in ways that were uncomfortable and necessary. The shift was real, but it was grinding and partial, and in the meantime, every night in every city in America, women were making calculations about their safety in their own homes that they shouldn't have had to make at all. If you walked into a doctor's office in 1985 with chest pain, you might be told it was anxiety. If you reported chronic pain, you might be handed a pamphlet about stress management. If you pushed back, you might be quietly labelled as difficult. For decades, medical research had been conducted largely on male subjects, sometimes literally only on men, and the results were applied to women with the confident assumption that human bodies worked more or less the same way regardless of sex. They do not. The consequences of this gap played out every day in examination rooms across America, where women's symptoms were minimized, misdiagnosed, or reframed as emotional rather than physical. The research problem was structural and had been accumulating for decades before the 1980s made it impossible to continue ignoring. Clinical trials, the studies that establish how drugs work, what dosages are effective, what side effects to expect, had historically excluded women, partly out of a misguided concern about protecting women of childbearing age from experimental treatments, and partly out of the simpler assumption that male physiology was the default, and female physiology was a variation that could be extrapolated from it later. It could not. But that conclusion took a long time to arrive in policy. Heart disease is the example that makes the clearest case. For most of the 20th century, heart disease was understood as a male condition, the stress-driven middle-aged man clutching his chest version that had been documented extensively in male research populations. Women got heart disease too. In large numbers, it is and was the leading cause of death for women in America, but their symptoms frequently presented differently. No dramatic chest clutching. Instead, jaw pain, nausea, fatigue, shortness of breath, a vague sense of wrongness that a doctor with a male-centered diagnostic framework might very reasonably interpret as anxiety or indigestion. Women having heart attacks were sent home. Some of them did not come back. The pain problem extended far beyond cardiology. Women reporting pain to their doctors in the 1980s were, research has since confirmed, less likely to receive adequate pain management than men reporting comparable levels of pain. The reasons for this are multiple and unpleasant. An old and persistent cultural narrative about women being emotionally expressive and therefore unreliable, reporters of physical experience, a tendency to attribute women's physical symptoms to psychological causes, and a medical training environment that had been built around male bodies and male presentations of illness, conditions that primarily or exclusively affect women, endometriosis, polycystic ovary syndrome, autoimmune disorders that disproportionately impact women were chronically under-researched and underdiagnosed. Women spent years, sometimes decades, being told their symptoms were normal, or stress-related, or simply part of being female, before receiving diagnoses that explained what had been happening in their bodies all along. The average diagnostic delay for endometriosis, a condition affecting roughly 1 in 10 women, was, and in many places remains, close to a decade. A decade of pain dismissed, while the research funding and clinical attention went elsewhere. In 1990, Congress mandated that the National Institutes of Health include women in clinical research, an acknowledgement that the gap was real and the consequences were serious. That mandate came at the end of a decade during which the consequences had been playing out, quietly and without accountability, in examination rooms across the country. The women who went to their doctors in the 1980s and were told their pain was psychological weren't imagining things. The system examining them simply wasn't built to find what was wrong. You worked a full day at the office, 8 hours, maybe 9 if you were proving something, which you often were. You came home, and then the second shift started. Dinner, dishes, homework help, laundry, school forms, permission slips, grocery lists, permission slips you already signed once but apparently needed to sign again. Sociologist Arlie Hochschild would put a name to this phenomenon in her 1989 book, aptly called The Second Shift. But women living it in the 80s didn't need a name. They just needed occasionally to sit down for 5 consecutive minutes without anyone asking them where something was. The data behind Hochschild's research was both unsurprising and somehow still startling when laid out plainly. Women who worked full-time outside the home were still performing the overwhelming majority of domestic labour inside it. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, household management, the invisible administrative work of running a family, keeping track of paediatric appointments, school events, social obligations, the emotional temperature of everyone in the house, landed disproportionately on women, regardless of their employment status. A woman could work 40 hours a week in an office and still come home to what amounted to a part-time job that started at 6 in the evening and had no defined end time. Hochschild calculated that women were working roughly 15 extra hours per week compared to their male partners when household labour was included. Over a year, that adds up to an extra month of 24-hour days, an extra month every year of labour that did not show up on any paycheck, that received no performance reviews, that generated no social security credits, and that was considered by the culture, by many of the people receiving it, simply what women did. Not work, just life. The division of labour inside the home in the 1980s was not primarily a result of individual male selfishness, though that existed too. It was the product of a set of deeply embedded cultural scripts that assigned domestic responsibility to women as something natural, something they were inherently better at, something they genuinely wanted, and that treated men's domestic contributions as optional, admirable when present, and excusable when absent. A father who bathed his children on a weekday evening was, in 1983 America, possibly described as a wonderful father. A mother who did the same thing was just doing Tuesday. Women who raised this disparity with their partners were often met with genuine incomprehension, not always defensiveness, sometimes just a complete absence of the framework required to see the imbalance as an imbalance. If you've never had to track the inventory of the refrigerator, or notice when someone's school shoes have been outgrown, the labour involved in tracking those things is invisible to you, and the invisibility was self-reinforcing. Because the work happened without being named or acknowledged, it could continue to happen without being shared. What the second shift cost women was not just time, it was the accumulated, compounding cost of never fully resting. Men who came home from work and sat down were recovering. Women who came home from work and started dinner were not. The fatigue was chronic and specific, the kind that doesn't resolve with a weekend because the weekend has its own unpaid shift attached to it. And underneath the fatigue was something quieter, the knowledge that the effort was invisible, that it was expected, and that the expectation would be waiting again tomorrow morning, reset like an alarm that nobody else seemed to hear. The 1980s gave women a clear message. You can absolutely have a career and a family. Wonderful. Here is no federal childcare infrastructure, no subsidized daycare, and a patchwork of private options ranging from expensive to unaffordable. The childcare crisis of the 80s was real, grinding, and disproportionately landed on women who were simultaneously being celebrated for having it all, and quietly expected to figure out the logistics of all entirely on their own. The waiting lists were long, the costs were high, and the guilt about whichever choice you made was entirely complimentary and available at all hours. Daycare in the 1980s, where it existed, was a private market solution to what was fundamentally a public policy problem. Parents who could afford it paid for childcare that consumed a significant portion of a working woman's salary, in some cases, most of it, raising the question of whether the financial case for working at all was sound. A calculation that conveniently made women's labour seem optional, just when they were fighting hardest to be taken seriously as permanent workforce participants. Parents who couldn't afford quality care cobbled together arrangements. Neighbours, relatives, informal home daycares of variable safety and quality, split shifts with partners when the schedule allowed. The federal government had, in 1971, come within a presidential veto of establishing a comprehensive national childcare program. The Comprehensive Child Development Act had passed both houses of Congress with bipartisan support before Richard Nixon vetoed it, describing it, in language that would be recycled for decades, as communal child-rearing and a threat to family values. The veto stuck. The infrastructure was never built, and by the 1980s, the absence of it was being felt most acutely by the women who had entered the workforce in numbers the economy hadn't prepared to accommodate. Quality childcare, licensed, regulated, staffed by trained providers, safe and stimulating for children, was in short supply and high demand. Waiting lists at reputable centres could stretch for years. A parent trying to secure a spot in a good daycare centre might place their name on a list while still pregnant, and still not reach the front of it before their child was old enough to start school. In the meantime, alternatives varied widely, and the variability itself was anxiety-inducing for parents who were leaving the people they loved most in the world with someone they had met twice. The childcare workers at the bottom of this system were and remain among the most poorly compensated workers in the American economy, a fact that is directly related to the work being associated with women, with care, and with a persistent cultural tendency to treat things women have historically done for free as things that don't require real wages when they are done professionally. Childcare workers in the 1980s were often paid poverty-level wages to perform work that required patience, skill, training, and genuine emotional labour. The irony was dense. Women who couldn't afford childcare were sometimes being cared for by women who couldn't afford not to work. For the mothers navigating all of this, the emotional cost ran alongside the logistical one. The cultural conversation around working mothers in the 1980s was thick with judgment flowing in both directions. You were abandoning your children if you worked, and wasting your potential if you didn't. There was no configuration that escaped commentary. The guilt was baked in, available regardless of which choice you made, because the choice had been framed as a moral one when it was actually, for most women, a financial one. You needed the income. The childcare cost most of it. The system called this a personal decision and moved on. Somewhere around 1982, a phrase entered the cultural conversation that would haunt working women for the rest of the century: having it all. It arrived in a blaze of magazine covers and empowerment rhetoric, suggesting that the modern woman could and should manage a thriving career, a happy marriage, a perfectly raised family, and an immaculate home, ideally while also being attractive, calm, and grateful. It was sold as progress. What it actually was, as millions of women quietly discovered, was a new, upgraded version of the old impossible standard, except now you had to be exhausted in a blazer instead of an apron. The phrase is most closely associated with a 1982 book by Helen Gurley Brown, editor of Cosmopolitan, who argued that women could have careers, marriage, and fulfillment without having to choose between them. The argument was genuinely well-intentioned and, in a specific context, liberating, a pushback against the idea that a woman had to sacrifice ambition for family or family for ambition. The problem was the all part. All, as a standard, is not compatible with being human. All requires no trade-offs, no limitations, no bad days, no choosing one thing over another because there are only 24 hours and you need to sleep in some of them. What having it all functioned as in practice was a new performance standard that absorbed the previous one rather than replacing it. The old standard said, be a good wife and mother and homemaker. The new standard said, be a good wife and mother and homemaker, and also have a successful career, and also maintain your appearance, and also be emotionally available, and also be interesting, and also be grateful for all of it. The old standard was a weight. The new standard was the old weight with a briefcase. Men were not asked whether they were having it all. The question did not arise. A man who had a career and a family was not navigating a cultural debate about whether his choices were sustainable or his presence adequate. He was just living his life, and the infrastructure of that life, the meals, the appointments, the remembered details, the emotional management of the household, was being provided by someone else, invisibly, as a matter of course. Having it all was never posed as a male question because men had been having it all, in the relevant sense, for generations. The question was only a question for women because for women it was genuinely new and genuinely hard. The women who couldn't make the formula work, whose careers stalled after children, whose marriages frayed under the pressure of competing responsibilities, who were simply too tired to be everything the standard required, were quietly held responsible for their own failure to achieve something that had never been structurally supported. The system didn't fail them. They failed the system. They hadn't been disciplined enough, organised enough, willing enough to sacrifice sleep or ambition or presence in the right ratios. The answer was always personal. It was never the impossible standard itself. By the end of the decade, some of the women who had embraced the concept most publicly were beginning to revise their positions. The cracks in the having it all framework were visible in the exhaustion statistics, in the rising rates of stress-related illness in working women, in the quiet conversations at kitchen tables about what it was actually like versus what it was supposed to look like. Progress had happened, real, meaningful, hard-won progress. But the standard that arrived to greet it had been set just high enough to ensure that reaching it was always one more effort away. Getting divorced in the 1980s was, for many women, the beginning of a financial crisis that the culture hadn't bothered to plan for. No-fault divorce had spread across most states, which was genuinely liberating, but the economic reality that followed often wasn't. Women who had spent years out of the workforce, or working part-time around family responsibilities, suddenly found themselves with limited earning power, inadequate alimony, and children to support. Studies from the period showed that women's standard of living dropped significantly after divorce while men's often rose. The law had caught up to equality in some ways. The economy and the decades of interrupted careers had not. No-fault divorce, the legal ability to end a marriage without proving wrongdoing on either side, was a genuine reform, and it arrived state by state through the 1970s and 80s. Before no fault, leaving a bad marriage could require proving abuse or adultery in court, a process that was humiliating, adversarial, and sometimes simply not possible. No fault removed that barrier and gave women in many cases, an exit that didn't require them to publicly catalogue their suffering in front of a judge. That was real progress, and it mattered. But no-fault divorce arrived without a corresponding reform to the economic architecture of marriage. The legal system's new approach to divorce was built on an assumption of equality, that two parties were separating as equals, with roughly equivalent capacities to rebuild. And if the marriage had been genuinely equal, that assumption would have been fine. Many marriages in the 1980s were not equal in the way that mattered most economically. The division of whose career had been prioritised, and whose had been sidelined to accommodate family life. A woman who had spent 10 years working part-time or stepping out of the workforce entirely to raise children and manage the household was not at the moment of divorce the economic equal of her husband, who had spent those same 10 years building a career with full-time focus. She had less earning power, a thinner resume, a gap in her work history that would require explanation in every job interview for years. The assets she'd contributed, the domestic labour, the childcare, the household management that had enabled his career to grow uninterrupted, was real but almost entirely uncompensated in divorce settlements. Alimony, which had once been the mechanism for addressing this imbalance, was being reconsidered in the era of no-fault equality. Courts moving toward a model of clean financial breaks and temporary rather than long-term support were operating on the theory that a capable adult woman could get back on her feet within a defined period. The theory was tidier than the reality. Re-entering the workforce after a significant absence, with limited credentials and in a job market that had been moving while you were elsewhere, was not a short-term project. The children, in most cases, stayed primarily with the mother. The child support system was under-enforced. Many fathers who owed support simply didn't pay it, and the mechanisms for compelling them were weak and slow. Women raising children on reduced income, with unreliable support in housing they could often barely afford, were doing so while also rebuilding careers from a disadvantaged starting position. The poverty rate among single mothers in the 1980s was high enough to have its own name in policy discussions, the feminization of poverty. It was not a metaphor, it was a demographic fact, and the divorce system had helped build it. Being a single mother in the 1980s came with a set of social judgments that arrived faster than any government assistance. The decade's political conversation frequently framed single mothers, and particularly poor single mothers, as a social problem rather than a population that might benefit from structural support. The term welfare queen, cynically popularised in Reagan-era political rhetoric, cast a long, damaging shadow over women who were, in most cases, simply trying to raise children with insufficient resources and maximum scrutiny. Single mothers were blamed for poverty, for crime, for the general decline of things. Rarely were they thanked. The welfare queen narrative had a specific political function. It allowed poverty to be reframed as a moral failing rather than a structural condition, and it did so with a face, specifically the face of a black woman, in the imagery that accompanied the rhetoric, though the reality of who received public assistance was far more demographically complex. The story Reagan told during his 1976 campaign, and that continued to circulate through the 80s, was about a specific woman in Chicago who had used public assistance fraudulently. That specific case was used to build a generalized narrative about an entire population of women that justified cutting the programs they depended on. The cuts arrived. Aid to families with dependent children, the primary federal assistance program for poor families, most of them headed by single mothers, was reduced under Reagan's budget policies. The cuts were framed as reducing dependency and encouraging self-sufficiency, which would have been a coherent argument if the jobs available to women with limited credentials had paid enough to cover housing and childcare and food simultaneously. They frequently didn't. The gap between what the rhetoric demanded and what the economy offered was paid for, daily, by women trying to raise children on the arithmetic the system provided. Single mothers in the 1980s existed across a wide economic range, and the experience varied enormously by class and race. Middle-class women who became single mothers through divorce faced one set of challenges: financial disruption, social stigma, the logistics of sole parenting. Poor women, particularly women of colour, faced all of that and a policy environment that had decided they were a problem to be managed rather than a population to be supported. The same political movement that described abortion as immoral was simultaneously reducing the resources available to women who had chosen to parent. The consistency in that position is difficult to locate. The social stigma operated at the community level as well as the policy one. Single mothers in the 1980s navigated neighbours' opinions, school environments, family judgments, and the specific texture of a culture that still organised itself around the two-parent household as the normative unit. Birthday parties, school events, the casual social world of parenthood, all of it was structured around a family configuration that single mothers were outside of, and the outsideness was noticed, commented on, and occasionally used as an explanation for things that had other explanations. What single mothers in the 1980s actually were, in most cases, was resourceful, determined, and doing something genuinely difficult without adequate support. The women who raised children alone in that decade, who worked and worried and stretched every resource and showed up for every school event and made it look, from the outside, like something manageable, were performing a sustained act of endurance that the culture around them was busy explaining as a cautionary tale. They deserved better. They knew it, and they got on with it anyway. There's a name for it now, though the problem existed long before the label did. The pink-collar ghetto described the vast landscape of female-dominated jobs: secretary, nurse, teacher, retail worker, flight attendant, that were systematically underpaid relative to male-dominated fields requiring comparable skill and training. In the 1980s, women were told the doors were open, the glass ceiling was cracking, and progress was happening. And it was, for some women in some fields. But the majority of working women in America spent the decade in jobs that paid less than they were worth, with fewer benefits, less security, and promotional ceilings so low you could feel them with your hand. The secretary, or administrative assistant in the language the decade was beginning to adopt, was the spine of the American workplace in the 1980s. She managed schedules, drafted correspondence, organised information, trained new employees, and functioned as the institutional memory of departments whose senior staff rotated in and out with their promotions and lateral moves. She was, in most cases, exceptionally good at her job, which required significant skill, considerable emotional intelligence, and the ability to manage the egos of multiple people simultaneously while appearing to do nothing of the sort. She was paid accordingly poorly for it, because the job was women's work, which meant it carried women's wages, which meant it existed in the circular logic that devalued it precisely because women were the ones doing it. Nursing is the comparable worth argument made visible. Nurses in the 1980s provided direct patient care, administered medications, made clinical assessments, managed medical equipment, and in many cases were the primary point of continuity in a patient's hospital stay. The skill requirements were substantial. Years of training, ongoing credentialing, high-stakes decision-making in time-sensitive situations. Garbage collectors, a job requiring less training and no clinical judgment, were, in many American cities in the 1980s, paid more. The difference was not explainable by market forces alone. It was explainable by which gender held each job and what each gender's labour had historically been valued at. Teaching followed the same pattern. elementary school teachers in the 1980s were overwhelmingly female, requiring college degrees and, in many cases, advanced certifications managing the cognitive, emotional and social development of 20-plus children simultaneously, performing labour whose results would compound over a lifetime. They were paid wages that reflected a long cultural history of treating the education of young children as an extension of mothering, natural to women, therefore not deserving of professional compensation. High school teachers, in a field with more male representation, were paid more. The children being taught were not more valuable. The workforce doing the teaching was perceived differently. Flight attendants had spent the 1970s fighting, literally in court, against policies that required them to be unmarried, within certain weight limits, and of a specific age range, as though the job were a modelling contract rather than an emergency safety role. They won those battles, largely. The work was still low paid, still disproportionately female, still evaluated in ways that mixed. Professional performance with personal appearance in a ratio that would have been considered outrageous in any male-dominated field. What connected all of these jobs was not their content or their skill requirements, but their history, a history of being performed by women, being compensated at female rates, and being considered natural expressions of feminine capability rather than professional labour deserving of professional wages. The pink collar was not a design feature of the economy. It was a decision made over time, repeated until it looked inevitable. And the women wearing it in the 1980s knew exactly what it cost them, even if the culture hadn't quite decided to agree. When AIDS emerged in the early 1980s, the public narrative centred almost entirely on gay men, and the suffering of that community was real, devastating, and criminally ignored by the federal government. But women were getting sick too, and for years the medical establishment failed to recognise, categorise or adequately study AIDS in women. Female-specific symptoms were not included in the official CDC definition of AIDS until 1993, which meant that women who were sick were dying without being diagnosed, without accessing treatment, and without being counted in the statistics that shape the public health response. The CDC definition of AIDS in the early years of the epidemic was built around the disease as it presented in gay men and intravenous drug users, the populations where it had first been identified and most extensively studied. Women who were infected presented with different opportunistic infections, different patterns of immune system decline, different clinical pictures that the existing diagnostic framework simply didn't have the vocabulary to capture. A woman who was HIV positive and developing cervical cancer, a condition now understood to be strongly associated with HIV infection in women, was not counted in the AIDS statistics. She was sick and progressing and dying, and she was not in the official numbers. This was not a minor bureaucratic distinction. The CDC definition governed access to disability benefits, to clinical trials, to treatment programs, and to the data that shaped the public health response. Women who did not meet the male-centered definition could not access the disability benefits they needed because they could not be officially diagnosed with the disease they had. They were excluded from clinical trials because the trials were designed around the male presentation of the disease. They were invisible in the statistics, which meant they were invisible in the policy response, which meant the resources and attention went elsewhere. By the time the definition was expanded in 1993, an unknown number of women had died without a diagnosis that matched what was actually killing them. The transmission narratives of the early AIDS crisis were also heavily shaped by male experience. The emphasis on sexual transmission between men and on needle sharing left heterosexual transmission, the primary route for most women globally, underemphasized in public health messaging. Women who were infected through heterosexual sex with male partners, some of whom did not know they were positive, were not the face of the epidemic that the media was constructing. The face of the epidemic was male. The face of the government's contemptuous indifference to the epidemic was also, thanks to ACT UP and other advocacy organisations, increasingly documented. But the face of the women dying quietly, undiagnosed, without access to the clinical framework that might have saved them, that face took much longer to appear. Black and Latina women were disproportionately represented among women with AIDS in the United States, and they faced the compound burden of racial health disparities, poverty, limited healthcare access, and the specific invisibility of being outside both the main AIDS narrative and the main feminist health narrative simultaneously. They were, in the most literal sense, not being counted, and not being counted meant not being cared for, in the way that the health system had already demonstrated it failed to care for people it wasn't looking at. The women of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s were not incidental to the story. They were part of it, dying in it, fighting in it, as caregivers, as advocates, as patients. They were just being told by the data and the definition and the policy response that they weren't. Geraldine Ferraro became the first woman nominated for Vice President of the United States on a major party ticket in 1984. It was a historic moment. It was also an extended masterclass in the specific kind of public dissection reserved for women in politics. Her finances were examined with a thoroughness applied to no male candidate in recent memory. Her husband's business dealings became campaigned, fodder. Her tone, her appearance, her likability, all were weighed on scales that her male counterparts were not placed on. She lost. The lesson the decade seemed to draw wasn't that we need to fix the scales. It was maybe next time. The scrutiny began before Ferraro had been on the ticket for a week. Her husband, John Zuccaro, was a real estate developer, and questions about his business dealings became a sustained campaign issue, not because the concerns were necessarily illegitimate, but because the mechanism by which a spouse's finances became a candidate's liability had an obvious and particular application to female candidates in a way it did not apply symmetrically. No one was subjecting the spouses of male candidates to equivalent investigation, because the assumption was that a man's wife was not his partner in the relevant sense. Ferraro's husband was treated as her liability in a way that a female candidate's spouse in that era would simply not have been. Her appearance was discussed with a specificity that no male vice presidential candidate had endured. Her clothing, her hair, her voice, described variously as shrill, sharp, or too aggressive, received column inches that would have seemed absurd applied to her counterpart George H.W. Bush, whose appearance was considered simply not a relevant factor. She was asked in a nationally televised debate whether she was strong enough to push the nuclear button, a question that managed to frame both her physical capability and her emotional stability as open questions simultaneously. Bush, standing beside her, was not asked an equivalent question about his emotional readiness. The experience was not unique to Ferraro. Women who ran for office at any level in the 1980s navigated a political environment that treated their presence as inherently noteworthy and their qualifications as perpetually provisional. Being the first woman in any given role meant that every decision, every statement, every mistake carried the weight of representing all women, while simultaneously being told that gender shouldn't matter and that pointing out the double standard was itself a political liability. The trap was elegant in its construction. The scrutiny was real. The complaint about the scrutiny made you look weak, and looking weak was disqualifying. Sandra Day O'Connor, confirmed to the Supreme Court in 1981, navigated a version of this in the judicial sphere. Her confirmation hearings were relatively smooth. Reagan had nominated her, which gave her significant political cover, but her subsequent career on the bench was conducted under a level of gender-related commentary that her male colleagues did not experience. Every decision was filtered through the question of what it meant that a woman had made it. Her identity was perpetually part of the analysis, in a way that Rehnquist's or Scalia's identity as men was simply not. Women in politics in the 1980s were proving something with every public appearance, proving they belonged, proving they were capable, proving the category was real. It was exhausting, ongoing, and entirely one-directional. No male politician was proving anything about his gender. He was just doing his job. The women were doing their jobs and also providing evidence for a case that, remarkably, was still considered open. She woke up early, worked late, exercised at lunch, cooked dinner from scratch, attended school events, kept the house presentable, maintained a social life, remembered everyone's birthday, and never, not once, appeared to be struggling. She was the superwoman, and she was everywhere in 1980s popular culture, in advertisements, in self-help books, in the smiling faces of women's magazine covers. She was aspirational. She was also fictional. The real women behind the image were frequently running on fumes, skipping meals, and lying awake at 3 a.m. wondering what they were, doing wrong since the woman on the magazine cover seemed to have figured something out that they couldn't quite locate. The superwoman image had a specific visual grammar in the 1980s. She appeared in advertisements wearing a business suit, holding a briefcase while simultaneously cradling an infant and somehow also implying that dinner was either already in the oven or would be shortly. She was thin, she was composed, she was smiling the smile of someone who had genuinely sorted it all out. She was selling perfume, or life insurance, or the idea that modern womanhood was not a contradictory and exhausting proposition, but rather an opportunity to demonstrate your exceptional management capabilities across all domains of human existence simultaneously. The advertising industry understood something useful, that if you could make a woman feel as though the standard was achievable, just barely out of reach, she would keep purchasing things in pursuit of it. The superwoman was a marketing concept as much as a cultural one. She sold productivity planners and vitamin supplements and time-saving appliances and self-help books about having it all of which implied that the gap between her and you was a matter of the right tools and the right attitude, rather than a matter of the standard itself being designed beyond human scale. The self-help industry of the 1980s was, in large part, a superwoman delivery mechanism. Books with titles that promised to help women manage everything better, feel less guilty, do more with less time, balance the competing demands of work and family. They sold in enormous quantities, which tells you something about the level of distress they were addressing. The books were largely well-intentioned. They were also implicitly accepting the premise that the demands placed on women were reasonable, and the problem was individual rather than structural. The solution was always personal optimization. It was never a shorter workday or affordable childcare or a husband who did his half. Women who couldn't perform the superwoman role, who were visibly tired, who let something slip, who admitted to struggling, experienced a specific kind of social penalty. The failure was personal. You hadn't organized your time correctly. You hadn't found the right system. You had, in some way that was yours alone to account for, come up short on a standard that other women were apparently meeting. The superwoman myth was most damaging not when women aspired to it, but when they used it to measure themselves and found themselves lacking, which was, given the nature of the standard, more or less inevitable. What was actually happening in homes and offices across America in the 1980s was that women were doing an extraordinary amount and being told it wasn't quite enough. The costume was uncomfortable, the cape had no structural support, and the woman wearing it was usually exhausted, occasionally resentful, and almost never asked how she was actually doing beneath the performance of having everything under control. The answer, in most cases, was holding on, which is not the same thing as fine, but which the decade was not particularly interested in distinguishing between. seeking help for your mental health in the 1980s required navigating a stigma so thick you could practically wear it as a coat. Therapy was discussed in hushed tones. Depression was something you were supposed to push through. Anxiety was reframed as nervousness, sensitivity, a personal failing. Women, who were diagnosed with depression at significantly higher rates than men, were often caught between a rock and a cultural expectation. Be strong enough not to need help, but don't be so strong you seem unfeminine. Medication existed but carried its own layer of shame. And health insurance, when it covered mental health at all, did so in limited, grudging ways. The 1980s relationship with mental health was shaped by a set of competing and contradictory forces. On one hand, therapy had been gaining cultural traction since the 60s and 70s. Seeing a therapist was, in certain urban and educated circles, becoming normalized, even fashionable. Woody Allen movies had made the analyst's couch into a cultural touchstone. On the other hand, outside those specific circles, mental health treatment remained associated with weakness, instability, and a kind of personal failure that a self-sufficient adult was supposed to have avoided. The distance between those two cultures was wide, and most women were navigating both of them at once. Depression in women was a well-documented clinical reality in the 1980s, and it was also frequently a well-documented clinical reality that was being undertreated. Women reported depressive symptoms to their doctors at higher rates than men, and were more likely to be prescribed sedatives or tranquilizers than referred to. Mental health treatment, a tendency with its own history, running through the Milltown era of the 50s and the Valium era of the 60s and 70s, in which women's psychological distress was managed pharmacologically rather than therapeutically, and often in ways that created dependency without addressing the underlying condition. The specific stresses of women's lives in the 1980s, the second shift, the wage gap, the childcare burden, the beauty pressure, the workplace harassment, the accumulated weight of performing competence and composure in environments that didn't make either easy, were real contributors to psychological distress that a prescription didn't address. But the prescription was faster, cheaper for the insurance company, and required no structural acknowledgement that the environment might be the problem rather than the woman's response to it. Anxiety was particularly prone to being minimized or mislabeled. The word itself carried connotations of irrationality. You were anxious because you were the kind of person who got anxious, not because the conditions of your life were objectively stressful. Women who reported anxiety were sometimes told to reduce caffeine and take a bath. The actual clinical weight of an anxiety disorder, the way it operates physiologically, the way it compounds over time without treatment, the way it is as real and as treatable as any other medical condition, was not the frame through which women's anxiety tended to be received in the 1980s general practitioner's office. The insurance problem was structural and significant. Mental health parity, the requirement that insurance plans cover mental health services at the same level as physical health services, didn't become federal law until 2008. In the 1980s, mental health coverage was typically limited to a small number of sessions per year, subject to higher copays and sometimes excluded from coverage altogether. For women who needed sustained therapeutic support, which is by definition what therapy requires to work, the financial barrier was often prohibitive. The stigma told you not to go. The insurance told you couldn't afford to. The result was a lot of women managing a great deal alone. The experience of being a woman in 1980s America was not the same experience for all women, and any honest accounting has to sit with that. Black women, Latina women, Asian American women, indigenous women, they navigated all of the same structural barriers that white women faced, and then a full set of additional ones layered on top. Workplace discrimination that intersected race and gender simultaneously. Healthcare systems with their own specific blind spots. A feminist movement that was, in the 80s, still doing the slow and necessary work of reckoning with whose voices it had been centering and whose it had been overlooking. The decade's gender story is not one story. It's several, running parallel, rarely acknowledged as such. The concept of intersectionality, the understanding that race, gender, class and other identity categories interact to produce specific and compounded forms of discrimination, was being formally articulated in this period. Legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw's foundational work on the subject arrived in 1989, drawing on employment discrimination cases in which black women had been harmed in ways that neither race discrimination law nor sex discrimination law applied as separately, adequately captured. The theory put language to something black women had been living for generations, that being a black woman in America was not the experience of being black plus the experience of being a woman, but a distinct experience that existed at the intersection of both, with its own specific texture and its own specific vulnerabilities. In the workplace, black women in the 1980s faced hiring, discrimination, wage gaps that ran deeper than the already significant gender gap, and the particular burden of navigating spaces where they were often the only person in the room who looked like them. The expectation of representing an entire group, of being, in every interaction, both an individual and a demographic, is exhausting in a way that is difficult to quantify, but that compounds over time. A mistake that a white woman could make as an individual was a mistake that a black woman sometimes made as representative, with different professional consequences. The mainstream feminist movement of the 1980s had roots in the mostly white, mostly middle-class second wave of the 60s and 70s, and those roots showed. Organisations like NOW were predominantly white in their leadership and membership, and their policy priorities, while important, did not always reflect the full range of concerns facing women of colour. Women of colour activists and scholars, Audrey, Lord Bell Hooks, Gloria Anzaldúa, among others, were doing the critical work of insisting that feminism had to account for all women, or it was accounting for some women, and calling that universal. The argument was not comfortable, it was necessary. Latina women navigated language barriers, immigration status vulnerabilities, and community structures that sometimes place strong cultural pressure on traditional gender roles, all while participating in a labour market that placed them disproportionately in low-wage domestic and service work. Asian American women contended with a set of stereotypes, the model minority myth, the exoticizing gaze, that rendered their actual lives and experiences invisible behind a flattening narrative that served no one. Indigenous women faced a legal and governmental landscape that had been actively hostile to their communities for centuries, and that the 1980s did not substantially improve. None of these women were peripheral to the story of being a woman in the 1980s. They were central to it. The decade's progress, such as it was, meant different things depending on where you were standing, and for many women, the view from where they were standing made the progress look considerably more partial than the magazine covers suggested. Walking to your car at night, taking a different route home, holding your keys in your fist, deciding not to go to a party because you'd be the only woman you knew there, lying about having a boyfriend to get someone to leave you alone, because I'm not interested apparently needed a male co-signer to be believed. The low-grade, constant, exhausting negotiation of personal safety that women conducted every single day, not because anything had necessarily happened, but because they had been raised to understand that it could. This wasn't paranoia in the 1980s. It was a reasonably calibrated response to a world that hadn't yet decided to take women's safety particularly seriously. The safety calculus that women performed was so routine, so embedded in the daily texture of being female, that many women didn't identify it as a burden. It was simply what you did, the way you checked for traffic before crossing the street. You didn't walk to the parking garage alone after dark. You called someone when you got home to confirm you'd arrived. You assessed the layout of a room, the location of exits, The ratio of strangers. You made decisions about clothing based partly on what would make you less visible, less targetable, less likely to attract the specific kind of attention that turned an ordinary Tuesday into something you'd be unpacking for years. The statistics underneath this daily practice were not reassuring. Rape and sexual assault in the 1980s were dramatically underreported. Estimates then, as now, suggested that a significant majority of sexual assaults were never reported to police. The reasons were familiar. Criminal justice system that subjected victims to scrutiny of their behaviour, their history, their sobriety, and their clothing in ways that would have been considered irrelevant in almost any other crime. The rape shield laws that limited the admissibility of a victim's sexual history in court were being passed and strengthened through the decade. But cultural attitudes changed more slowly than legislation. Being believed remained a significant obstacle. Stranger danger was the publicly discussed version of the problem, but the data told a more complicated story. Most sexual violence was committed by people known to the victim, partners, acquaintances, family members, co-workers. The concept of marital rape as a crime was still being worked out in 1980s law. The marital rape exemption, which had historically prevented men from being charged with raping their wives, was being eliminated state by state through the decade, but it hadn't been fully gone from American law until 1993. The idea that a woman's consent was perpetual within marriage and that its absence within marriage was therefore not a crime was only recently being retired as a legal position. Street harassment was ubiquitous, named only as a concept much later, and not considered a serious issue by the mainstream culture of the 1980s. Comments, following, touching on public transit, the low-level intrusions that added up over the course of a day into a sustained reminder that public space was not equally public, were considered part of the landscape rather than a problem with a solution. Women who reacted were overreacting. Women who ignored it were managing. Neither response was acknowledged as the reasonable adaptation to an unreasonable condition that it actually was. What accumulated over a lifetime of this particular kind of vigilance was a specific form of exhaustion, not dramatic, not the kind that presents itself for treatment, but the quiet, persistent depletion of always having to think about your own safety in spaces where other people didn't have to. You got used to it, the way you get used to background noise, and like background noise, the silence when it finally, sometimes, lifted, was when you realized how loud it had been all along. On paper, the 1980s were a time of expanding legal protections for women. Title IX was a decade old. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act existed. Pregnancy discrimination had been illegal since 1978. Sexual harassment had a legal definition. These were real victories, won through real struggle. And then there was the gap, the canyon, really, between what the law said and what actually happened in offices, courtrooms, hospitals and homes across the country. Laws change faster than cultures do. In the 80s, women were frequently living in that gap, legally protected in principle and quietly unprotected in practice. Title IX, passed in 1972, prohibited sex discrimination in educational programs receiving federal funding. By the 1980s, it was having real effects. Girls' sports programs were expanding, women's enrollment in higher education was rising, professional and graduate schools were opening to women in numbers that would have seemed remarkable a generation earlier. These were genuine, measurable changes. And then in 1984, the Supreme Court decided Grove City College versus Bell, which narrowed Title IX's application to only the specific programs within an institution that received federal funding, rather than the institution as a whole. Overnight, the law's reach contracted significantly. It took 4 more years of legislative effort and a congressional override of a presidential veto to restore its broader application through the Civil Rights Restoration Act of 1988. The law had been there. Then less of it was there. Then it came back. Women living, through that period, were navigating a legal landscape that was moving under their feet. The Equal Pay Act's gap between legal requirement and lived reality has already been discussed, but the mechanism is worth examining. The law said equal pay for equal work, and the enforcement mechanism was a complaint process that required individual women to identify the disparity, gather evidence, file a complaint, and navigate a bureaucratic and sometimes legal process while remaining employed in the workplace where this disparity existed. The structural advantage was entirely with the employer, who controlled the pay information, could invoke confidentiality policies to prevent employees from comparing salaries, and faced an enforcement apparatus that was underfunded and slow. The law existed. The law working required resources, courage, and a tolerance for professional risk that not everyone could afford. Pregnancy discrimination law prohibited firing or refusing to hire women on the basis of pregnancy, but the definition of what counted as pregnancy discrimination remained contested in practice throughout the decade. Women were passed over for promotions, assigned to less visible work, or quietly sidelined in ways that were difficult to document and more difficult to prove. The law said you couldn't be fired for being pregnant. It did not say your career trajectory couldn't be affected, that assumptions couldn't be made, that the invisible calculation about your future availability couldn't happen in someone's head during a promotion decision. Restraining orders existed but required enforcement. Domestic violence law was strengthening but slowly. Sexual harassment law was developing but left enormous gaps in what it covered and how it could be pursued. Anti-discrimination law was real, but enforced primarily through individual complaints rather than systemic review, which placed the burden squarely on the person least able to bear it. The law is not nothing. Every one of these protections was won through effort and mattered to the women who used them. But the law, in the 1980s, was frequently a framework that had been constructed and then not fully furnished. Rights established without the enforcement mechanisms, the institutional culture, or the resources to make them fully operational. Women lived in the space between the promise and the delivery, and they learned to calibrate their expectations accordingly. Now, and this matters, the 1980s were not only a decade of struggle, they were also a decade of women finding each other in consciousness-raising groups that had carried over from the 70s, in neighborhood networks, in workplaces, in the particular kind of friendship that forms when two people recognize that they're both carrying the same invisible weight. Women in the 1980s built communities, called each other after difficult days, showed up for each other in ways the culture around them frequently didn't. They organized, they marched, they wrote, they published, they supported each other's small businesses and large ambitions. Survival, in any era, is rarely a solo act. The female friendship of the 1980s has been somewhat sentimentalized in retrospect. The big hair and wine coolers and telephone calls that lasted an hour version. But underneath the cultural shorthand was something genuinely sustaining. Women who were carrying the second shift, the beauty pressure, the workplace navigation, the general ambient weight of the decade were frequently doing so in the company of other women who understood the specific texture of it without requiring explanation. That specific understanding, the shorthand of shared experience, is not a small thing. It is, in fact, one of the primary mechanisms by which people survive difficult conditions without breaking. Consciousness-raising groups, a feature of the women's movement since the late 60s, were still operating in various forms in the early 80s. The format, women gathering to talk honestly about their experiences, to identify the structural in the personal, to name things that had previously been considered private, had produced the feminist theory of the 70s and continued producing something more immediate in the 80s. the experience of not being alone in what you were going through, the loneliness of carrying invisible labour, of navigating double standards, of being told your experience wasn't real or wasn't that bad. That loneliness was significantly reduced by sitting in a room with other women and discovering that they were carrying the same thing. Women's professional networks were forming and growing in the 1980s, partly in response to the reality that the informal networking structures that had benefited men for generations, the after-work drinks, the golf games, the old boy connections, were not equally accessible. Women's professional organisations in fields from law to medicine to business were providing both practical support and a kind of institutional solidarity. The understanding that you were not navigating this alone, that other people in your position had found ways through, and that the collective knowledge of that navigation was available to you. The cultural output of women in the 1980s, the writing, the art, the music, the comedy, was doing something similar at a larger scale. Toni Morrison was publishing. Audre Lorde was speaking. Whoopi Goldberg was performing. Cyndi Lauper was making the argument that girls just want to have fun with a directness that cut right through the decade's more oppressive beauty and behaviour standards. These were not trivial contributions. They were the ongoing project of women insisting on the full complexity of their own experience in a culture that frequently preferred a simpler story. The women who made it through the 1980s, who built careers, raised families, fought for change, held each other up, did so not because the decade made it easy, but because they were stubborn and creative and, crucially, because they were rarely doing it alone. The friendships were real. The support was real. And on the worst days of a complicated decade, the knowledge that someone who understood was one phone call away, on a phone with a cord, which you tucked under your chin while doing something else, because the second shift was always happening, was frequently enough. Not every woman in the 1980s smiled through it. Some of them were extraordinarily, productively, historically loud. Gloria Steinem was still publishing, still speaking, still making people uncomfortable in all the right ways. Sandra Day O'Connor took her seat on the Supreme Court in 1981, the first woman ever to do so. Sally Ride launched into space in 1983. Toni Morrison was writing. Alice Walker won the Pulitzer. Shirley Chisholm had already run, for president a decade earlier, and never stopped running towards something. The women who pushed back in the 1980s didn't always win immediately, but they moved things, and the moving mattered. Gloria Steinem and Ms. Magazine were doing something specific and important in the 1980s, providing a publication that treated women as full political and intellectual subjects rather than consumers of beauty tips and recipes, which is not to say beauty tips and recipes are beneath anyone, but rather that a magazine that talked about equal pay, reproductive rights, and workplace discrimination as though they were serious subjects deserving serious coverage was, for many women, the first place they encountered their own lives reflected in print. Ms. had launched in 1972, and by the 80s had become an institution, a touchstone, a thing you either subscribed to or knew someone who did. It was also a consistent target for the culture's discomfort with women who insisted on being taken seriously, which meant it was doing something right. The entry of women into previously male-dominated fields during the 80s was, field by field, genuinely historic. Sally Ride, the first American woman in space in 1983, became one of the most recognizable figures of the decade, not just for the achievement, but for the calm, precise competence with which she inhabited it, and for the press conference questions she was asked about whether she cried, which she handled with a restraint that spoke louder than the questions deserved. The message her presence sent was not subtle. Women could do this too, and had always been capable of it, and the only thing that had been preventing it was the decision not to include them. In literature and art, the decade produced a remarkable volume of work by women who were refusing to tell comfortable stories. Toni Morrison's Tar Baby arrived in 1981. Beloved, the novel that would win, the Pulitzer and eventually the Nobel in 1987. Alice Walker's The Colour Purple was published in 1982 and won the Pulitzer the following year, a novel that looked directly at the violence, sexuality and spiritual complexity of black women's lives and did not look away. Sandra Cisneros published The House on Mango Street in 1984. These were not peripheral works, they were the literature of the decade, and they were written by women who had decided that their full experience was a legitimate subject. The activists and organisers of the 80s were doing work that was less visible, but equally essential. Women who worked at domestic violence shelters, who staffed reproductive health clinics, who organised workplace campaigns, who filed the complaints and the lawsuits and sat through the depositions. They were moving the legal and institutional landscape in ways that didn't make magazine covers, but that changed what was possible for the women who came after them. History tends to remember the loudest voices. The quieter work of institutional change is often what makes the loud voices possible. The women who pushed back in the 1980s were not always celebrated for it at the time. Being loud, being difficult, being the person who filed the complaint or ran for office or wrote the uncomfortable book, these were costly choices. The cost was real and it was paid. What was built with it is still, imperfectly and incompletely standing. Girls who grew up in the 1980s were watching all of it, from the floor of the living room, from school hallways, from the back seats of cars. They were watching their mothers navigate workplaces that hadn't quite made room for them. They were watching the magazines, the movies, the television shows that told them what a woman was supposed to look like and want and say and be. They were filing it all away in some internal ledger, some of it inspiring, some of it quietly damaging, all of it formative. The women who came of age in the 90s and beyond carried the 80s in them, the ambitions and the wounds, the progress and the unfinished business. Television in the 1980s was teaching girls a curriculum that ran parallel to their formal education. The female characters available as models ranged widely, from the sharp, capable women of shows like Cagney and Lacey, two female detectives doing serious work and having serious lives, a genuinely radical proposition for primetime television, in 1982 to the more familiar landscape of women whose primary narrative function was their relationship to the men around them. The lessons were mixed, sometimes within the same hour of programming. Here is a woman doing something impressive, and here is the same show evaluating her based on whether she's also likeable, also attractive, also appropriately invested in her romantic prospects. The body image transmission was happening early and continuously. Girls who grew up in the 80s were exposed to Barbie, who had been around since 1959 but whose cultural dominance was at full tilt in the 80s, and to the cheerleader ideal, and to the teenager in every film whose romantic success was directly correlated with a physical transformation, and to the fashion magazines that were being read by their older sisters and occasionally by them, and to the diet culture that was operating at every level of the adult world around them. They were absorbing, before they had the language for it, a very specific and narrow idea of what a female body was supposed to look like, and what that had to do with your worth as a person. They were also watching their mothers work. The mothers of the 80s were the first generation of American women to be in the paid workforce in large numbers, while simultaneously managing primary parental responsibility, and their daughters were watching how that worked, which is to say, watching it work imperfectly and expensively, and without adequate support, and watching their mothers do it anyway with a combination of competence and exhaustion that left a specific impression. Many daughters of the 80s grew up with a complicated inheritance, the clear message that they could achieve anything, and the equally clear demonstration that achieving it would cost something, and that the cost would largely be theirs to pay. The girls who were teenagers in the 80s were the first generation to grow up with feminism as a named and culturally present phenomenon, which meant they also grew up with the backlash against it as a named and culturally present phenomenon. They heard the word feminist used approvingly and pejoratively often in the same week, sometimes by the same people. They were developing their identities in a cultural moment that was actively arguing about what women were for and what they were allowed to want, and they were doing this while also navigating school and friendships and the ordinary chaos of adolescence. What they took from it, the resilience, the ambition, the body image struggles, the complicated relationship with the word feminist, the bone-deep understanding that the world was not going to simply make room for them, and they were going to have to make it themselves, shaped the women they became. The 80s didn't just happen to the women who lived it as adults. It happened to the girls who were watching, and they carried it forward. Here is where we end up, sitting at the edge of the decade looking back at it honestly. Some of the things that defined being a woman in 1980s America are genuinely, measurably better now. Credit cards, legal protections, maternal leave policies, workplace harassment frameworks, the scaffolding is more solid. And some of what defined that decade is still, in different packaging, recognisable. The beauty pressure, the wage gap, the second shift. The political scrutiny applied to women's ambitions and bodies, they didn't vanish when the cassette tape stopped playing. Progress in the 1980s was real. So was the resistance to it. Understanding both is how you understand where we are now and how much further there still is to go. The women of the 1980s did not know they were living through a decade that would be analysed and debated and reconsidered for the next 40 years. They were just living, trying to make rent and raise children and do their jobs and have some semblance of a life that contained joy, alongside the weight of it all. The historic significance was invisible to them, the way the historic significance of ordinary life always is to the people living it. They were not making history, they were making dinner and making meetings and making do in a decade that required a great deal of making do. What they built, despite the obstacles and frequently because of them, was not nothing. The legal framework that exists now was built through the work of that era, through the lawsuits filed and the campaigns organised, and the arguments made in courtrooms and congressional offices and on the opinion pages of newspapers. The cultural shift that made certain things unacceptable, workplace harassment, for example, or the open dismissal of women's physical symptoms, didn't arrive on its own. It was constructed incrementally by women who were tired of the alternative and decided to spend their energy on the construction rather than the complaint. The wage gap that existed in the 1980s has narrowed. It has not closed. Women today earn more relative to men than they did in 1982, and that progress is real and has material consequences in real people's lives. Women today also still earn less than men for comparable work, still face disproportionate career penalties for parenting, and still make up a fraction of the senior leadership in most industries. Progress and incompleteness coexist, which is uncomfortable for anyone who wants a cleaner story, but is the truth of how change actually moves. The beauty pressure is different now, distributed across more platforms, operating at higher volume, with the added efficiency of algorithms that can calibrate exactly which insecurity to address at exactly which moment. The core mechanism, here is the standard, here is the product that closes the gap, here is the gap again, has not changed because it works, and it worked in the 1980s, and it works now. The neon leotard has been replaced by different packaging. The business model is the same. The women who were girls in the 80s are now the mothers and the managers and the legislators and the writers of the current moment. They're carrying the decade in them, its ambitions and its damage, its genuine progress and its unfinished business. They know, from experience rather than theory, what the gap between the law and the lived reality feels like. And many of them have spent the decade since working with that knowledge as fuel to narrow it. Not because it's easy, because they watched their mothers do the hard version and decided it was time for a different one. There is a kind of work that does not appear on any job description, does not show up in any performance review, and generates no compensation of any kind. And yet it consumed a significant portion of every working woman's day in the 1980s. It is the work of managing how you are perceived, not your actual performance, not the quality of your output or the soundness of your judgment. The perception of those things, which in a workplace that had not fully decided whether women belonged there, was an entirely separate project requiring entirely separate effort. You did the job, and then you managed the impression of you doing the job. Both were full-time. The preparation started before you arrived. Clothing chosen not for comfort or even pure professionalism, but for the precise signal it sent in a room where you were already being evaluated on factors your male colleagues were not. Too feminine, and your authority was questioned. Too severe, and your likability took the hit, and likability, you had learned, was somehow still a professional criterion applied to you in ways it was not applied to the men in the same meeting. You were looking for a register that didn't fully exist, the one where you were taken seriously and also not considered threatening, competent and also warm, confident and also approachable. You were looking for a costume for a role the culture hadn't finished writing. In the meeting itself, the work continued. You had learned, through experience and observation, the specific geometry of being heard in a room that wasn't entirely sure it wanted to hear you. You knew to speak early, because women who waited to speak were sometimes not called on at all and the window closed. You knew to state your position directly because hedging was read as uncertainty. But you also knew that being too direct would generate the specific social friction that followed women who said plainly what they meant. You knew that if a man restated your idea 5 minutes after you'd said it and received the credit for it, the most professionally viable response was usually not to point that out. After the meeting, there was the relationship maintenance, the additional layer of interpersonal management that women in the 1980s workplace performed to keep the environment functional, smoothing tensions, reading the emotional temperature of the team, remembering the details of colleagues' lives that made them feel seen and therefore cooperative. This was not manipulation. It was skill, genuine, significant, emotionally demanding skill that the workplace relied on and did not compensate for, because it was considered natural to women rather than a professional contribution from them. A man who did this was unusually emotionally intelligent. A woman who did this was just being a woman. The cumulative cost of this invisible labour was not dramatic. It did not produce a breakdown or a defining moment. It produced instead a persistent low-level drain, the kind that makes you slightly more tired at the end of every day than the official work should account for, that makes the weekend feel shorter than it is, that accumulates over years into a form of exhaustion that has no obvious single cause. You were tired, but you couldn't point to the specific thing that was tiring you. The specific thing was the sum of 1,000 small performances, each one individually unremarkable, collectively enormous. What was never asked, what the 1980s workplace was not structured to ask, was what would be possible if that energy went somewhere else. If the hours spent on perception management went into the work itself, or into rest, or into the kind of sustained creative thinking that requires a mind not partially occupied with monitoring how it's being received. Nobody calculated that cost. The women paying it mostly didn't have time to. In the 1980s, ambition in a woman was a complicated thing to carry. It was not by itself a problem. The decade was full of messages encouraging women to want more, reach higher, lean into the power suit and the corner office, and the possibilities that previous generations hadn't had access to. But ambition in practice, in the daily negotiation of a workplace and a culture that was still calibrating its feelings about women who wanted things, had edges that the motivational posters didn't mention. Wanting the promotion was fine. Being visibly, unapologetically focused on getting it was a different matter. The ambition was acceptable. The showing of it required careful management. The double bind had a specific texture. A man who pursued advancement aggressively was displaying exactly the qualities that advancement required. The behavior and the reward were aligned. A woman who pursued advancement with the same directness was, depending on the day and the evaluator, either admirably ambitious or uncomfortably pushy, and the line between those two assessments was not clearly drawn, was not consistently applied, and was not within her control. She could perform the same behavior and receive either response, and the variable was not her behavior. It was the perception of her behavior by people whose comfort with female ambition varied. Negotiation is where this played out most concretely and most expensively. Research on salary negotiation has consistently found that women who negotiate assertively are penalized socially in ways that men who negotiate assertively are not. Rated as less likable, less collaborative, less desirable as colleagues. This meant that the act of advocating for your own value, a fundamental professional skill that compounds over an entire career in its effect, on lifetime earnings carried a social tax for women that it did not carry for men. Some women didn't negotiate because the risk felt too high. Some negotiated anyway and paid the social cost. Neither choice was cost-free, and the costlessness was available only to the men in the same room. Geography mattered in a more literal sense as well. The expansion of women's professional opportunities in the 1980s was not evenly distributed across the country. In certain cities, in certain industries, in certain educational and professional circles, the changes were real and visible, women entering law firms and hospitals and corporations in numbers that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. In other places, smaller towns, more traditional industries, communities where the cultural conversation about women's roles hadn't shifted at the same pace, the opportunities were narrower and the resistance to women's ambition more overt. A woman in a rural community in the 1980s who wanted to be something other than what the community expected her to be was navigating not just a workplace, but an entire social environment that might read her ambition as a rejection of the people and the place she came from. The cost of ambition there was not just professional, it was relational, communal, sometimes familial. Wanting more could mean leaving. Leaving could mean losing. The geography of opportunity was also the geography of loss. What the decade never quite managed to resolve was the question of what to do with all the ambition it had encouraged women to develop. The doors were more open than they had been. The rooms behind them had not been entirely rearranged, and the women who walked through carrying their ambition plainly, who declined to apologize for wanting what they wanted, who decided the social cost was worth paying, they moved things. Not as far as they deserved, not as fast as they should have, but they moved them, and the movement was real. In 1980s, America, a woman's body was many things simultaneously. A subject of public commentary, a site of political contestation, a professional variable, a target of the beauty and diet industries, and somewhere underneath all of that, her own. The last category was, in practice, the smallest. From the moment she left the house in the morning to the moment she returned to it, a woman's body was available for evaluation, regulation, commentary, and opinion from sources she had not invited and could not entirely avoid. This was not occasional or exceptional. It was the ambient condition of being female in the 1980s, so constant that it mostly didn't register as remarkable, which is perhaps the most remarkable thing about it. The commentary came from everywhere and wore different clothes depending on the setting. At work, it arrived as the professional calculation embedded in every hiring and promotion decision, the unspoken assessment of how a woman presented physically, whether she was attractive enough to be an asset and not so attractive as to be a distraction, whether her weight and grooming and general appearance communicated the right level of investment in her own professional image. These assessments were real, documented in research, and performed on women in ways they were not performed on men whose bodies were simply not part of the professional evaluation in any comparable way. On the street, the commentary was direct and unsolicited. Catcalling was so normalised in the 1980s that the question of whether it was a problem had not yet become a mainstream conversation. It was simply what happened, what women navigated as a condition of moving through public space, adjusting their routes and their clothing and their expressions accordingly. The adjustment was so automatic, so built into the daily routine, that many women would not have described it as a response to harassment. It was just what you did. The fact that men did not have to do it was noted only occasionally. In the doctor's office, the body was evaluated against standards that were simultaneously too narrow and too male-centered to account for its full reality. The research gaps, the diagnostic blind spots, the tendency to reframe physical symptoms as emotional ones that meant women's bodies were routinely failing to receive the medical attention they were signalling a need for. The body was present in the examination room. The framework for understanding it was not always adequate. And then there was the political dimension, the decade-long argument about what women were allowed to do with their own reproductive systems, conducted entirely in public, by people who did not live in those systems, about decisions that affected only the people who did. The 1980s made reproductive rights a sustained public battleground, in a way that required women to defend, repeatedly and exhaustingly, a basic claim to bodily self-determination that the culture treated as genuinely controversial. What women developed, navigating all of this, was a complicated and largely unconscious relationship with their own bodies, one shaped not just by their own experience of inhabiting them, but by the accumulated weight of everyone else's opinions about them. The body that was supposed to be the most intimate, most personal thing a woman possessed had been so thoroughly colonized by external evaluation that the experience of simply being in it, without performing it or defending it or managing it, was sometimes genuinely hard to locate. It was yours. It just didn't always feel that way.